God said to Amos, "What do you see?" And what did Amos say? A plumb line. For those who don't know the words, this is a plumb line. Or at least it could be used as a plumb line. That's actually off my key ring, but it is actually made of pewter, which is quite heavy and includes a certain amount of lead. The plumb line, probably the simplest piece of equipment, and yet the most accurate piece of equipment that any builder has. You can have a ruler which might have its measurements slightly out. You can have other instruments or measures that don't quite give you true readings, but the plumb line always points in the same direction, towards the center of the earth. And if you use a plumb line correctly and hold it still, it has a heavy weight on the bottom so it stays still. You can mark it with chalk, and you can bang the thread against the wall, and you get a straight and vertical line. So if you want to build any building, this is what you need. Build a wall that doesn't fall over. This is what you need. Simple, but infallible. Always points the way you want it, and if you follow its directions, will always give you a perfect vertical upright. No doubt. God said to Amos, "What do you see?" And he said, "A plumb line." "I'm setting a plumb line among my people Israel," said God. A standard which is unfailing. They already know about it. It's simple, pure simplicity. They know their God. And I have already told them the standard that I expect from them. This is a sign of it. Straight and true and upright. You wouldn't think that something so simple could have any amount of controversy within it. Or that the other visions that Amos was given could have been misconstrued, misunderstood. And yet, when Amos told the king got very upset. First of all, let me explain a little bit about the geography. Here is the Middle East today, as it says. So we've got our measure of where we are. Okay. This huge desert area is Saudi Arabia. Then above it, Iraq. Now, if we're not very good at geography, we still know those names very well. Saudi Arabia is where the oil comes from. Iraq is where some of us had a war a few years ago. Next to Iraq, I need a stick. There's one, sort of stick. And next to Iraq, just there to the left, the top corner, is Syria. Syria, which is currently at the top of the news headlines. And there, just below Syria, just down the end of the Mediterranean Sea, is Palestine. That's the context in which we find that land. Turn around, and next to the plumb line, Israel and Judah in the time of Amos. Now it's perhaps not too clear on this map because of the shading, but at the bottom, until up to that line there, is Judah. Above it is Israel. In the time of King David and King Solomon, some years before Amos, those two kingdoms were one. The old Israel. The old kingdom with Jerusalem at its heart, stretching to the north to Galilee. You can see from the Dead Sea here up to the next lake, Lake Galilee. That was all the one kingdom of David. But during the time of Solomon, also a great king, much revered by the people even today, they got into economic difficulties. It's not overplayed in the account in the Bible. But Solomon built the temple. He built much more as well. They had to import good wood from Lebanon, there to the north. They had to import all kinds of things to make it the best temple ever. They spent huge sums on the civil service. They wrote down, to our benefit, all the ancient stories. It was at that time that many of the books that we have in our Old Testament were written, the earlier books. And that was done also at great expense, to pay the scribes who were well educated and got a high salary for their job, to pay the priests who looked after the temple. No expense spared. Money, no object. But that was one reason why the country got weak. We need to think about that in 2012. A world in economic crisis. There were other reasons too. And the prophets explain some of it by the fact that they had left behind their loyalty to God, even though Solomon, in his wisdom and in his faith, believed that the temple was not his temple, but the temple of God alone. The people had other ideas. Kings who followed Solomon were not so religious or faithful. They married wives who came from other parts of the world, forming alliances, but also forming alliances with other religions. The religion of their fathers fell into disrepute. The prophets condemned all this and prophesied in a way of foretelling that this would lead to the downfall of Israel. Well, first it led to the breakup into two parts of Israel. To the north, Israel, which retains the name, and to the south, Judah, which was known in the time of Jesus as Judea. But in the time of Amos, this is the map. Amos came from the southern kingdom. Amos came from a farming community. Of course, most of the people were involved in agriculture. Amos looked after the sheep. We don't know whether he was simply the shepherd or whether he was the owner, whether he was rich or whether he was poor. He looked after the sheep, and he also looked after the trees, the sycamore fig trees. But God called him. And God called him away from this. And God said, go and prophesy. Go and declare my word, but not to the people of Judah, in his own part, his own country, to the people in the northern kingdom, Israel. Amos was told to go north and speak to the king and the people of Israel and prophesy to them. So, that is the setting for his prophecies. And that explains, I think, what we have heard, some of what we've heard from that reading in chapter 7 of Amos's book. Amos, a shepherd from Judah, goes as a prophet to the kingdom of Israel. And the king, as we read, was none too pleased. The king did not like what Amos was saying. He felt insulted, perhaps, at a foreigner coming to tell him that God would set a standard among his people. You come to me, he said. You come to me in the city here. You come to me at Bethel. You come to me and you prophesy, you speak, and you tell me this is God's word for the people of Israel. You're a foreigner. What right have you got to say these things here? And Amos must have felt somewhat nervous in what he was saying and in this meeting with the king. The king said to him, go back down south. Preach to the people in the south. Earn your money from prophesying there. And Amos responded by telling the king just who he was. I'm just a shepherd. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just a shepherd. I look after the sheep and I tend the trees. But God called me and God sent me here. Have no doubt about it. And he said a few more very strong things to the king. By this time, he was getting quite courageous. We didn't read on just after where we stopped in that passage. He declares to the king himself, your wife is going to become a prostitute, and all kinds of other things are going to happen in your kingdom. Grounds for convicting him of treason, perhaps. A foreign agent coming to disturb the kingdom. Did he come as a spy? Did he come to try to assist the southern king to bring about the downfall of the kingdom of Israel itself? Was he the scout leading in advance of the Judean army? Well, imagine this. How bold Amos was at this point. And his prophecies didn't end. They became stronger. short book. As far as we know, he didn't suffer oppression. He didn't suffer arrest at the hands of the king of Israel. Perhaps his words were so bold, so powerful, that they really did convict the king himself and the nobles in his country. Perhaps this word was so powerful, surely it was, that it caused not just anger but consternation and a sense of penitence, guilt, of recognition of where they stood. God says, I am setting this plumb line there in the midst of the people of Israel. I am setting that standard that cannot fail, that cannot go wrong. And the standard was recognized because while the king could say we worship, and we've always worshipped on this hill, and we worship in the great city of great traditions, the traditions that go back to Jacob and the time before him. As much as he could say that, he could also remember the great traditions that followed. The traditions of the law of Moses being brought not just to the southern kingdom, but to the entire nation at that time. Remembered the traditions of the time before they had kings, the judges, the priests set the standards, and the people respected the standards that the priests set because they knew that they came from God. They respected the standards that they received through the scriptures that were written down in the time of Solomon. The king of Israel was forced to listen. We move on to the time of Jesus. Now the country is united. Let's see. Stretching from Beersheba in the south, way up north to Galilee, and even Caesarea Philippi. And not much further north, right, almost in the top right-hand corner there, Damascus. So we have the scale here, you can see. Damascus, the current capital of Syria, is very close to Jerusalem. The news that we're reading today is very close to the heartland of the Bible. Jesus himself came from the north, from Nazareth, in the region of Galilee. You can see where it says area of detail up there, that blue sign, and there's the map of that area with Galilee at the centre. Nazareth, just on this side, the town where Jesus grew up. And you'll see, not far south, here to Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Jesus, of course, was by origin from the family of David, town of Bethlehem, where he was born. But it was in the north, Nazareth, where he grew up, after a a time of exile in Egypt, further down south, and southeast from there. His cousin John began the ministry of Jesus by baptizing him, and began the preparation for the coming of Jesus to his people, his ministry, by preaching in the wilderness, the Judean wilderness, which is just this side of the Dead Sea, that area of very hilly, mountainous land, which is almost a desert. Very few people living there. There are no towns down there. It's too hot and too dry. John the Baptist spoke out against the evils of society in his day, and particularly against what the leaders were doing. He had good cause to do that, and discovered how right he was, the manner of his arrest and his death. John the Baptist was arrested. He was in the custody of King Herod. Herod actually didn't have much jurisdiction in the south. His area was further north. But Herod had been given his position not by the people, by the Romans. The land was united, not because of the local people, but because of Rome. It was Rome that had given Herod his authority. And Herod took far too much upon himself. It's recognized in the Gospels that Herod had limited authority. When we read about the arrest, trial, and death of Jesus, remember, Jesus has to be taken to Pilate for sentencing. It is only Pilate, the Roman governor of the region, who can sentence someone to death. Herod asked Jesus a few questions. Herod wasn't particularly interested in sentencing him. This was the later Herod, of course. But Herod was not someone to be cowed by the authority of Rome. He'd been given his place by Rome, but given his place by Rome, but given limited authority. But when it came to this family party, and John was arrested, John was in his charge, and when his wife, who was really the one who'd been most upset by John, she was his brother's wife, he'd married, when his wife wanted to get rid of John, it turned out in a way that Herod couldn't disagree. His birthday party. He wanted to give his daughter a present. Well, it's an unusual kind of present as it turned out. He wanted to give her something nice, up to half the kingdom. But she perhaps somewhat under the thumb of her mother, went and consulted. Mother said, "This is our chance. Ask for John's head on a plate." Even the gory details are there recorded in the Gospel. Herod couldn't deny his daughter because he made his promise to her in front of all the noblemen and women of Palestine at that time. They were all there for the party. He had made a promise he could not lose face. Kings do not break their promises, especially when they've made them so publicly. Here we discover the sadness of King Herod. Herod did not want to do this, but he was forced to by his wife. There's no judgment here on women or wives generally, but we do often find that behind, I remember my chaplain making this statement, behind every great man, there's a great woman. Behind many powerful tyrants, there are also very powerful women.